Yes, so Acts chapter 8, as I mentioned, the first 8 verses, which are kind of the broad interludes of Luke, the author of this account of the apostles, where he's giving broad detail, filling in the historical account, before he then moves into a more specific, well, 2 specific accounts from verses 9 through to 25 regarding Simon the magician, and then verses 26 through to the end in verse 40, which is about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. And so we'll cover those in successive weeks following this morning. But verses 1 through 8 serve as is common. We've zoomed back out to the macroscopic perspective before then zooming back into a microscopic perspective in the rest of the chapter. So we'll read the text, we'll then pray, and then begin our study from there. So Acts chapter 8, verses 1 to 8. And Saul approved of his execution. And there arose upon that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentations over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ. And the crowds, with one accord, paid attention to what was being said by Philip, when they heard him and saw the signs that he did. For unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who had them, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I mentioned, this is the macroscopic perspective that Luke has now zoomed back out to, where he's explaining the broad details of the aftermath of the trial and execution of the first martyr of the church, Stephen, and then explains some details that then set up for us, as I mentioned, the rest of the chapter, where we get 2 specific accounts of what has occurred or what occurs consequently due to the scattering that's mentioned here twice. And so we'll begin in verse 1 and work our way through from there. So you see in verse 1, the beginning, a thematic continuation of what had just been read throughout chapter 7. And Saul approved of his execution, him referring obviously to Stephen. This is, again, one of the early mentions. We had Saul as a figure introduced in chapter 7, of him in those last couple of verses being a witness and bystander to that event and to that execution, to that martyrdom. There was the fascinating sentence about, if you recall, I forget exactly which verse it was, but I can go back and have a look. It was just right towards the end there in verse 58. And the witnesses, right, those who were stoning and those who had accused falsely, they laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And that's the first mentioning in the book of Acts of Saul, who would become Paul. And so again, we explained, if you recall, in that last session we had, that was done as a sign, basically, as a symbol of his, to one degree or another. We're not told exactly what it was officially, but he certainly had an element of authority over what was occurring there. And the laying down of their garments at his feet kind of showed that he was one who was overseeing this occurring, while the others were stoning Stephen to death and beating him to death. essentially on, not necessarily on Paul's behalf, on Saul's behalf, but rather on his command to one degree or another. And again, Saul is still a young man at this point, passionate and zealous. And so then Luke here is mentioning as a continuation, right, which is signified by that word kai in the Greek, which is and for us in English. And Saul approved of his execution, right? And so this is where we get that exegesis from verse 58. So Saul having approved of this execution, right? And then now he continues on. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And then as he continues, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. We'll explain that second half in a minute. But there arose great persecution. So Luke here is indicating that this was not just an isolated stoning of Stephen. This was the launching of a significant persecution, the first major persecution against Christianity, especially on the official level, is beginning here. And some of the details that we get throughout this section this morning will indicate kind of what was then being conducted. So more to come on what that great persecution is being detailed as here. But this is the first instance that we're seeing of a systematic campaign of persecution. One that begins a very long line that's been going on for 2,000 years now, on and off to varying degrees in parts all around the world. Obviously, as many of you are aware, even to this day, Christianity is by far and away the most persecuted religion or ideology in the world, and it's not even close. There is no religion that has ever been more persecuted than Christianity at any time period. You still have, estimates range and vary, but you still have into the tens and indeed hundreds of millions that are estimated to be living under one level of persecution or another, again to varying degrees depending on the country. The idea of Christianity being at enmity goes all the way back, as you can see, to the very beginning. And so that's something important to remember when at times in society there isn't enmity, and that's not a bad thing. We should wish for peace, we should hope for peace, we should pray for peace. But realizing that decisions regarding peace and enmity a lot of the times are not in our hands. They are often in the hands of those who have established themselves as the enemies of God, who create enmity and who put themselves at enmity through their ideologies, their beliefs and their practices. So a greater persecution arose, and again we'll explain some of the detail we're getting, particularly when you get to verse 3. But what we're told here is as a result of this persecution, which begins now here against the church of Jerusalem, they were all, as in the church in Jerusalem, were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. Right? So they fled. They fled the persecution that was going on in the city of Jerusalem and went out into the countrysides of Jerusalem and even more broadly through to Samaria. There's a number of interesting points here. Apart from we'll get onto one of them in a second, that's connected for us in chapter 11. We'll cross-reference that in a minute. But one broad point is actually regarding that concept of scattering. Now, the word that gets used there with regards to scattering, diaspero, is where we get the word diaspora, or to disperse. Right? So this is obviously the first mentioning of it here in the scriptures. There's only 3 in total. 2 of them are here in chapter 8. You'll see the word scattered. Does anyone else have any different word than scattered in second half of verse 1?
No,
scattered, scattering, yep.
Yeah, scattered.
Yeah, that's fine. Scattered is probably going to be a common translation there. It's only if someone put dispersed, which you could equal as well. But so scattered or dispersed, right? They were scattered throughout the regions of Judea. You'll see the word used again in the beginning of verse 4. So now those who were scattered went about. So that's the second reference. The third reference to this word scattering is in Acts chapter 11. So I just want you to have a read there in the second half of verse 1. Right? They were all scattered. They were all dispersed throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, right? Except for the apostles. Okay.
Interesting detail.
Yeah, and we'll get onto that in a minute. Turn through to Acts chapter 11, so a couple of chapters later. Acts chapter 11 and picking up in verse 19. So Acts chapter 11 verse 19. Let me read to you from there. Now those who were scattered. All right, so this is the third and final reference that we get to this word from which we get the word diaspora or dispersion. All right. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen, this is what this is referencing. This is referencing back here from chapter 11, referencing back to chapters 7 and 8. All right. Those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen travelled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch. Right? So this is what's meant by those broad details like Judea and Samaria. It's very broad, vague terms. This is a bit more specific. Phoenicia is a general area. Phoenicia is the Phoenicians, and the area of Phoenicia is one of the Canaanite lands. The Phoenicians were one of the most widely travelled people in all of antiquity, founding colonies from the Black Sea all the way across to Carthage in North Africa. But Phoenicia is roughly, very roughly, equivalent to modern-day Lebanon and some northern parts of Israel, areas like all the way down to Acre and Tyre and other such areas throughout that northern coast of Israel, and more importantly, most of Lebanon. Okay, so that's Phoenicia. Cyprus is the island of Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean. If anyone needed a map, we might still have some of those maps. Costa, are you able to find that Roman Empire map over there, the one in the red? Yeah, if you can just grab those. Is there one? How many is there? Two? Okay. If you just want to pass one up there and just give me one so I can make reference to it. Yep. There you go. So you'll see, if you look there, you can see Judea and Jerusalem on the eastern side of the Roman Empire there. You'll see it circled, Judea and Jerusalem. Near Mesopotamia, you'll see it circled Judea and Jerusalem. If you go just up from there, you see two major cities, Sidon and Tripolis. So Sidon and Tripolis, those are more towards the areas of what is Phoenicia, certainly Tripolis, right? Sidon also as well. And if you keep following up that coast, you'll then see Antioch. So Antioch.
Isn't there two Antiochs?
There's two major Antiochs. That's Antioch of Syria, right?
Yeah.
There's also other Antiochs. So Antioch there's more than one place called Antioch, but that is the main Antioch when people say Antioch. In the eastern Mediterranean there, not far off the coasts of Antioch and Tripolis, you'll see the island of Cyprus. Yeah. So Cyprus has had a long-standing Christian history, going quite a ways back, indeed to the 1st century. And so they travel as far as Phoenicia, which is those lands of Sidon, Tyre, Acre, etc., where modern-day Beirut would be, those kinds of areas. That's Phoenicia, right? The northern Canaanite lands. They also traveled to Antioch, which is north of that you saw there, as well as to the island of Cyprus, right? So they dispersed outward, right? And speaking the word to no one except the Jews. In verse 20 we continue. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene being back down over here in North Africa, near the word Libya. Cyrene here, that's where that Simon the Cyrene was from. So these were members of the church who had been in Jerusalem, because you got to remember that the church of Jerusalem, if you recall, the church of Jerusalem was not entirely made up of Jews just literally from Jerusalem. In fact, the majority had come back at Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, and were from all around the empire, right, and beyond the empire, and had then decided to move to Jerusalem to be part of the founding church. So the men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who on coming to Antioch, what they did, because they would have been able to speak Greek, they themselves would have been, to one degree or another, Hellenic. They spoke to the Hellenists. Your translation might say the Greeks. It's specifically referring there to Greek-speaking Jews. So they spoke to the Hellenists also, so not just the Jewish Jews, as in the Hebrew-speaking, non-Greekified, non-Hellenic Jews, but the Jews more accustomed to the ways of Judea and Jerusalem. They also then spoke, these diaspora Jews, who are now Christians, they also now spoke to the Hellenists, preaching the Lord Jesus, we're told there. So this is what goes on. You can read all the way through there. And the hand of the Lord was with them. A great number who believed turned to the Lord. The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. Right? What this does is this is then the establishment of the church in Antioch. And you'll notice there, just because I'm not going to exegete it now, I'm going to cover it later on, obviously, when we get to this chapter. But you'll see there in the end of verse 26 that in Antioch, the disciples, right, the followers of Christ, were first called Christians. Right? Coming from the Greek term Christianos, meaning follower of Christ. And so this is the establishment of the church at Antioch. So the point being drawn here, and it's in its connection, circling back to chapter 8, is that the church in Antioch was founded specifically as a consequence of the diaspora or the dispersion that occurred because of the persecution of the church of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 8. Does that make sense? So the persecution and the launching of this campaign by the Jewish authorities against the church only ended up spreading and multiplying the church. Okay?
Just like the Lord.
Yes, yes. What they intended for evil, God intended for good. That's an ancient saying that goes way back, as you know, and yet still faithfully applies even to this point for us 2,000 years ago, but for them thousands of years after those words were ever said or written. Yep.
The placement of the word scattered is very interesting here. For many reasons, for the reasons that you've been expounding.
No.
But it's in significant contradistinction to the unity that we've seen in the previous chapters in Acts, where they were all together, praying together, not leaving one another's company. They were in the upper room waiting expectantly. They knew not what, but they were in unity and in constant prayer.
Yep.
They weren't even leaving the premises.
Not often other than to evangelize and stuff like that. Yeah, sure.
And then suddenly...
It was the hub, yeah.
We have this word scattered. So the unity is broken.
Yeah, certainly on the well, not necessarily organisational, certainly on the kind of surface level, yes. So there is that contradistinction. You are right. What's interesting here, and there's a number of points to raise about this concept, is that obviously we've mentioned that the byproducts of the scattering, of the dispersion, ended up actually being advantageous to the church, right? Because we're not onto it yet. Again, we start to, by the time we start to get into some of these middle chapters of like 10, 11, 12, etc. of the book of Acts, we start to get into the real meat and potatoes regarding the church at Antioch, which is the second church of the church, capital C. It's the second church in history, and so that I'll leave a lot of the commentary for that to those chapters. But nevertheless, Antioch has a major role, and one could even potentially argue has an even bigger role, at least pragmatically speaking, than Jerusalem ends up having throughout the rest of the book of Acts, and certainly the first 2 centuries of the church, 2 to 3 centuries, so certainly the first 300 years of the church. Antioch has a larger impact, not necessarily from an authoritative perspective, but a pragmatic one, certainly. Antioch became basically the missionary headquarters of the church. Paul's missionary journeys were launched from Antioch, for example, and many others as well were launched from Antioch. It's the place where they're first called Christians, as we're told there. It as a very important strategic port city, provided major avenue through which to get to Asia Minor and through to Europe. If you were coming from the east, especially east beyond Rome, like the Parthian Empire and all the way through to Central Asia, you would go through Antioch, either to then travel on the roads through Antioch, so you keep going on land, or to get to Antioch to then travel via sea. Right? And so major strategic importance. So it had incredible significance, this diaspora, that worked out monumentally more beneficial than it was negative. The other side of it too, actually you jump in because my point's a bit longer, so go in there.
It's I want to the significance of this change in tone and change in circumstances is, I think, becoming even more clearer to me, because much hinges on it. In chapter 8, verse 8, it says, "And there was much joy in that city."
Yep.
Because of the miracles.
Yeah, referring to them in Samaria, yeah, up the north.
And the preaching. In previous chapters, whenever we had the preaching, Peter's sermon, Stephen's sermon,
yes, yeah,
there was the writer, the coda to sentences that
Touché. Yep.
to the words to the effect, and multitudes were being added.
Yeah.
Okay, that coda is absent here.
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
What I think it's saying is that the time for the Jews had ended.
It's certainly you're starting to see a shift here. So that's where, and again, I'm trying to leave some of the exegesis for the later chapters. Right?
What I'm saying is we are now definitely into the church age, which is the Gentile age. You're starting
to see a shift away. So yes, if on that point what you're referencing is the reality that the Church of Jerusalem was, by every indication, exclusively Jewish, right? And so Jews from all around the place, they weren't just Jews of Jerusalem. In fact, the vast majority were Jews from not Jerusalem, but still Jews though, is that when you then start to see this movement beyond the city confines of Jerusalem, you now start to see mass integration of Gentiles. Yes, correct.
Yep.
And that's what then starts to come up over the successive chapters.
And importantly, the Gospel according to John has not one mention of the kingdom of God. That's not mentioned.
Yeah, so that's what makes... Yeah, so John's is unique for a variety of reasons. That's one of them.
In other words, that opportunity which Jesus himself gave, the Lord, the Saviour, to the Jewish nation, ended around these chapters that we're speaking about.
Yeah, it's a progressive thing. It's not necessarily a completely binary of right up until this point and then we get a shift. Certainly not this early on, but we're in a transitional period between Old and New Covenant. 100%, yes, and that explains a lot of what you end up reading. So again, some of the other thoughts I'll leave for the later on chapters. But one thing on the concept of scattering there is that in terms of applications, right? Because we don't necessarily, we haven't had to think about this until recently. We should have been, but we haven't in the West at least. There are times, like quite clearly, not just from the scriptures, but from history generally, when you analyse the history of the church and its relations to different areas of the world, when fleeing, right, departing from the place that you're in when persecution hits, is not a bad thing, is not a sinful thing, is not a wrong thing at all. There are times where it's absolutely necessary for the survival of the church. And this goes way back. It goes back. This is obviously one example here. We know for a fact that the Church of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when the Romans breached the walls during the Romano-Jewish War, they fled the city just before they managed to breach the walls, right? And they fled to the east, right? As Jesus had commanded them back in Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse, right? When you see this great persecution coming, flee to the hills in the east. And they did that. They fled to the east. Josephus records them having done that. They abandoned the city, but they fled the city. As the Romans then breached and then wiped Jerusalem to the ground. There's countless other examples of fleeing persecution. There are times just simply trying to stick it out and remain in a place that is so obviously and evidently anti-Christ, right? In that sense of being anti-Christian and anti-Christ, the way that John refers to it in his epistles, is often and in fact I would argue probably the vast majority of the cases, a fool's endeavour. Not because you don't trust God, it's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with the obvious pragmatic realities of what you're standing in front of. There are increasingly places in the West, and this will only continue to get worse over the coming years and decades, but there are places where Christians, I can tell you, unless there's a massive dramatic change by a miracle of God, Christians will have to flee there. Flee from there. There are places already in the West that I would argue Christians should abandon and leave now. They're not necessarily in Australia. There are some jurisdictions in the United States I would argue they should do that. There's one jurisdiction in Canada I'd argue they should do that. There are a couple of other jurisdictions I would argue they should do that in the West. Because it's not, all you are doing is you are going and just tossing the proverbial seed upon concrete, not upon fertile soil at all. Okay, it's so obviously asphalt, and it's just going to get nothing and do nothing. Okay, and so we sometimes have forgotten those analogies and parables that Jesus gives and those words that Jesus gives explaining those things, right? About soil having been prepared, right? About not casting your pearl before swine, right? That which is precious, and that's a reference to the gospel, by the way. That the pearl in that parable is the gospel, right? And not casting your pearl before swine, right? Before swine, obviously being, keeping in mind Levitical law, completely unclean, right? Unclean, unworthy, etc. Blah, blah. Not casting that which is precious, right? The gospel of Jesus himself before them. He wasn't kidding when he said those things. It doesn't mean that you're selfishly selective about just deciding a priori whether or not they are or are not worthy to hear. But the idea that you're going to just stick it out, if we just keep at it, then it's all good, things will then start changing. Maybe, also most likely not. Certainly not in your lifetime. Maybe down the track, 100%, for sure. But not necessarily you. This is why having a broad and having a big picture perspective of church history is really, really, or history generally, but in this case church history is really, really important. I was just explaining to someone the other day some of the early history of the Christianization, the conversion of the Germanic tribes, right? The Germanic tribes being the German pagans of northern and central Europe. They always lived beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. The Romans never managed to conquer the Germanic tribes. They famously tried to, and then had one of the most historic losses in the history of military history at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. But nevertheless, the Christianization and the conversion of the Germanic peoples really didn't start occurring until essentially the 6th century, right? When the Franks, who were a Germanic people that had crossed the Rhine into Gaul, or what we call France. The Franks is where we get the word France from. They're the predecessors of the French. They started converting in the 500s, right? When their king, Clovis I, converted to Christianity in 496. So that's the beginning of the conversion of the Germanic peoples from very brutal paganism, German paganism, into Christianity. That's 500 years later, okay? God's timetable for how he decides to act in his sovereignty over the world is a lot longer than ours. He's not confined to 70 and a mortal life here on earth, right? So if you're thinking about, I've sometimes tried to put myself in the mind of going back into the 1st or the 2nd century and being a Christian bishop or missionary and so on and so forth, anywhere in the Roman Empire, and going, all right, I'm going to go in and I'm going to cross over the Rhine. I'm going to go into the lands of the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and go into the lands of the Alarics and so on, blah, 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 and the Franks, and so. And if I just stick it out, it'll all work. No. No. What'll happen is you'll get slaughtered and nothing will happen. Okay? It's not a message of hopelessness. You need to hear the balance of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that just simply deciding to just stick it out amidst a people who are so evidently and clearly hostile and clearly not actually receptive is literally a death wish. Okay? You need to start to break into that for sure, but breaking into it without the clear evidence of the Spirit of God having already begun to work in that environment is a fool's endeavor. You get even a reference to this kind of thing in the broad detail, not in the literal detail specifically, but broad details where the apostles wanted to go up into Macedonia and up into Macedon and were told no. No. Not yet. Not yet. Right? Were the Macedonians ready? Had the Macedonians been prepared? Had the Spirit of God been working in the Macedonians? Probably not. Potentially not. We're not told, but we're not given the literal reason why no. But those kinds of inferences, or at least those logical deductions, are certainly open to be drawn there. That's why you can read so many times throughout church history where missionaries have gone to far distant lands that have been pagan since the beginning of humanity itself, and the missionaries roll up, and you literally have the tribal chief and his people. We've been waiting for you. Yes. Like, you can read it. There are accounts of that in South America and in parts of Africa, where you have those kind of reactions like, "Are you the one that has been sent to us?" Imagine being a missionary or an evangelist, or whatever the context is, right? A bishop, whatever it happens to be, and you've gone and you've trusted God, you've survived the high seas, you've been starving, you've got this, blah 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 blah, and you arrive, and these people who could not be more different from you, if they possibly tried, especially if there are distant ethnic distinctions, and they ask you, "Are you the one we've been waiting for?" Or "Are you the one who has been sent to us?" Like, there are literal accounts of people like, "Are you the one that have been sent to us?" There's one tribe in South America that said that. Like, that's the Spirit of God having prepared in the hearts and the minds. Do you understand?
They must have rejoiced when that was said to them.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah, exactly. How much of a... And I see no reason to disbelieve the litany of accounts that go that way. It's not in contradistinction to anything we see regarding the character or the actions of how God operates and how He's revealed Himself to operate. So there are places where increasingly in the West, I would argue, again, this is not me trying to whip out a crystal ball. It's just simply a matter of using logical analysis of the scenarios in which a lot of places in the West are increasingly finding themselves, where those places have turned into asphalt, they've turned into concrete, not fertile soil, not even partly fertile soil, where there's some receptiveness but a lot of antagonism. Because even if there's some receptiveness, you can still maybe do some work there for sure. But there are places that have just completely turned into concrete. And so the reality of that having occurred and starting to occur in the West needs to be a consideration for Christians in terms of where they live and in terms of where they plant churches, and all those kinds of conduction of things. You just close the one. And
Jesus said, if they persecute you in one city, go to
another city. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. If even in the house, even in the context of a house, if you stay in a household and they reject the message, brush the dust off of your feet. That's essentially the ancient equivalent of just, okay, on to the next. On to the next. It's not just sitting there smashing your head against the wall trying to make something, just trying to conjure something up. What it does, ironically, and I'll finish on this point and then move on to the next one, is that it actually, just trying to stick it out and going, oh, if I just try doing this a bit differently or do this harder or blah, 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 what you're actually doing is you're effectively, you may not be consciously doing it, I'm willing to allow for that obviously, but what you are functionally very much doing is treating conversion, right, and the regeneration of the heart, justification, all that kind of stuff, you're treating it as if you're the one who can somehow generate it and bring it about. You can't. It's a very Arminian perspective. You can't do it that way. It's Pelagian, really, actually, but yes.
What you're saying has very significant and broad implications for missionaries.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
To whom and for whom we expend a lot of prayer time.
Yeah.
And financial resources.
Yep.
We're employed imploring God to support these missionaries that our own church supports,
Mm.
and various others here and there. There are thousands.
Yep.
And you have to ask yourself, they've gone into countries where the law of the land says it's illegal to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what are those missionaries doing morning, noon and night? They're not allowed to preach the gospel. They'll end up in prison. You know what they're doing? A lot of them in Africa and Southeast Asia, they're digging wells. Or
Yeah.
they're growing little veggie patches and being friendly to the natives.
Mm.
Is that missionary work, ladies and gentlemen,
Yeah.
brothers and sisters?
Yeah, that's the problem.
And are they on the mission field because it's exciting, because they want their children to grow up
That can be.
with second language?
Not always, but it's the balance of what everything I'm saying here should be taken in balance, right? So there's always going to be risk. Obviously, there's always inherently going to be risk that occurs in missionary work. To one degree or another, there will always be. Otherwise, doesn't really quantify or qualify as missionary work. But it's about actual strategic, not just value, but possibility, right? So there has to be an assessment, insofar as mortal man is capable of conducting it, of actually analysing and assessing legitimate, rational, biblical prospects of the venture that you're undertaking. If I was to sit here and go, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to Pyongyang, right, the capital of North Korea, and I'm going to plant a church. Okay. So good luck. The response if I just say that to someone, the response to me should be, good luck. Good luck getting into for starters. Good luck getting residency there. For starters, because I can absolutely that's going to be good luck getting that, because the idea of a white Westerner from in this case an AUKUS nation, Australia, Canada, sorry, Australia, UK, US alliance nation. Good luck with that. And then even if you somehow magically got residency under the pretenses that you were going to help with such and such a thing, good luck ever preaching the gospel, because your movements will be surveilled 24/7. You will be watched in your sleep. There will not be a literal moment of your life that will not be on camera. You will sleep on camera. You will go to the toilet on camera. You will shower on camera. You will walk to the garbage bin on camera. You will take your dog on a walk on camera. Everything will be done on camera. There is no such thing as you not being surveilled in Pyongyang. It doesn't exist. And you're going to go and preach and tell them about how the Kims are not gods and how Jesus actually is, and that the Kims are nothing in the faith. You're going to do that, and you're going to tell me that you're not going to be caught inside of a week and then put to death. Good luck.
What you're saying is that a lot of missionaries have gone onto the mission field because of their own pride.
There are those who have, yes. And so, no, gosh, no, he doesn't mean everyone, no. And so, but there are those who certainly have. The missionary work should always be encouraged. It should just be done with biblical wisdom. Like it should be done using biblical principles and during wisdom. What we've had, unfortunately, in the last 100 years, certainly not like overwhelmingly, I just mean like you've seen a significant rise in it, is that we spent a lot of time over the last 100 years, a lot of the time with the backing of Western governments, of being able to go into Africa or South America, or pick a place, right, but usually Africa, and build a whole lot of infrastructure, obviously the common example is things like wells, build lots of things like housing and roads, and it's a lot of pragmatic things. Not that those things individually or in isolation are bad per se, they're not. But we spent a lot of time building wells and not as much time building churches in places where we could otherwise be, right? We've seen a rise in that, where the humanitarian, to use the modern term, the humanitarian objectives have been at the forefront, and the kingdom objectives, the missionary objectives have, to one degree or another, sometimes in massive degree, taken back seats to one degree or another. That's not a universal claim. It's not even a majority. I'm not putting a number on it. I'm just saying that it's very evidently occurred to a greater degree.
There has been said in later days,
Mm.
you can't preach the gospel until you fill their stomachs.
Mm.
And that means you take their food in, you dig their wells,
Mm.
and then you preach the gospel. And I've always thought, no,
No.
throw it back to front.
Yeah, back to front. Yeah,
But
yeah.
they really do believe they're doing the right thing.
Yeah. I'm not knocking. Yeah, I'm not necessarily
And
knocking
they are
motives
good
per se.
things, but
Sure.
the gospel should be the priority.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the gospel has to be. It has to be, because all you end up doing, like, it's not, you know. And again, I'm not putting a number on what kind of percentage that would be impossible to quantify, but I know of examples where, like, for an entire lifetime of insert missionaries' ventures, it's just been the building of infrastructural things, and then they pass away, someone else takes up the mantle, and then something happens in the context around them. A military coup happens, a war breaks out, it all gets wrecked in the first place, and they're back to square one. And so what was the point of that? At all, when no church was ever really established there, like at all. You established infrastructural things, but no church. All the point is that that kind of missionaries, that any missionary work and any missionary venture needs to be done on biblical principles, and as you point out, the gospel has to be the forefront priority, right? You do those other things 100%, but the preaching of the gospel, the establishment of churches, etc., like all that's endemic to that, has to be leading as the leading purpose for what's done there, right? The entire book of Acts is a testimony to that. Okay, it is. Like, the entire book of Acts is a testimony to that, of Paul going into places that were well developed, less developed, etc., and the gospel is always the leading venture there, right? Before anything else ever starts to occur, and other things do occur, but what's the forefront of the actual venture?
I'll tell you, OM in the very beginning, because I was in it
Yeah.
from the beginning,
Mhm.
always said they were going with the gospel, praying for a ship to take the gospel.
Yeah, for sure.
And various groups said, no use going into Africa and India with the gospel if you don't take the food in for them. We never took food in. We didn't supply any food to them. But there were other companies
Sure, yeah.
that said, if you're going into India, to Africa, we've got some tins of this,
Yeah,
take them to the people of India.
Yeah.
But the gospel went first.
first. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
They got criticised for
No, I know, but that's
because
the
they
biblical
weren't
model,
doing
though.
What the outward appearance
Yeah.
was to feed them.
Yeah, I know. And that's what I'm saying about the balance. It's not that those things are unimportant.
Yeah.
It's about, but see, I don't. The Buddhists will go in there and feed them. The Muslims will go in there and feed them. It's not.
That's right.
UNICEF will go in there and feed them. Godless atheists at the United Nations will go in there and feed them. That's got nothing to do with, you know what I mean? Anyone can feed them, but you're bringing them.
These children go hungry. So once they have come to the Lord, they realise they have power to pray for their
Yeah,
needs.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's all those kind of things. But you are right. The gospel has to lead in those any missionary journey and any missional venture of any kind. The gospel has to be the forefront. Yeah. So, circling back, what we see in verses 2 and 3 is that in Acts chapter 8 is that devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. Of course, as they would, right? It would have been a horrifically massive, significant loss that would have grieved them greatly for obvious reasons. But then we're told in verse 3 that Saul, right, was ravaging the church. That word ravaging there is actually a pretty interesting word. Lumainomai. It's only used once in the entire scriptures, and it's used here. So it's another hapax legomenon. Does anyone else have anything other than ravaging?
It says havoc.
Creating havoc. Yeah, you could say
Havoc.
made havoc. Yeah, okay.
Terrible word.
Yeah, no, but it's
A lot of chaos.
yeah, made havoc. Yeah, It's an interesting word. Very, very strong. It's a verb, but it's a very, very strong word in the Greek. Very strong verb. It could be translated a lot of different ways in the English. Ravaging, making havoc for sure. What it really actually has to it, though, is it really kind of has, from all of my reading going back into classical antiquity, is that the word has the connotation of corrupting, spoiling, ruining. As is the case with a lot of ancient, like both Greek and Hebrew, a lot of imagery associated with that. A good way of thinking about it, it's vivid, but it's just the nature of the word. Is it's really like it's like what's the best way of putting it? It's like someone being attacked, particularly a woman, and being attacked in a violent fashion, and having her clothes torn and ripped off and beaten, right? And in the case of very violent instances of rape, it's like that. That's the imagery. That's the kind of imagery that this word kind of typically is. That's a good way of thinking about it, of what this word is. It's a spoiling, a ruining, a corrupting, in that kind of sense. It's a very on the nose word. It's very strong in the Greek, that's for sure. And so Luke's choice of it here, and it being the only usage of the word in the scriptures, is kind of really meant to be a real punch in the face, in terms of the power of the word, right? So he is just ravaging and yeah, exactly, and trying to tear the church to shreds. As Luke mentioned in verse 3, he's entering house after house, dragging off men and women and committing them to prison. This kind of language is very short and simple, but what he's essentially describing in ancient terms here is a massive state-sponsored sabotage campaign. He is going at this. This is essentially this is secret police behaviour. Okay, what we referred to in the last 100 years as secret police, right? So Gestapo, KGB.
Yeah, the Gestapo just marched in on them.
Yeah.
Houses and trashed them.
Yep, exactly. Yep, and so they were exactly, and so it's not. It's a public sabotage. This is not just specific targeting of Christians. It is that. It's just much broader than that, right? So this is done not only to take out specific targets, and so I can guarantee you that they would have formulated, if they did it in any systematized, organized fashion, which they for sure would have, and that's the indication we're given. This is a systemic, organized venture on the part of the Jewish state here, is that they would have had specific lists of targets they would have been trying to acquire, certain high value targets that they would have been going and looking for. They could have, the vague term of dragging off men and women and committing them to prison covers that notion. It also covers the notion of them then capturing suspected Christians, dragging them to prison for interrogation and torture.
Like the Jews, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so dragging them off to then torture and interrogate them, to then find out more information about their particular targets that they were looking for, more high value targets, like the apostles, for example. So dragging off suspected, just to use a generic term, lay Christians, like not the apostles, right? Just regular members of the church, dragging them off, interrogating them, asking them where is Peter, and asking them for locations on Christian sources, all these kinds of things, right? And are you jumping here yet?
It's I've never thought about it before. You said systematized. It's got to be.
100%.
It's a state Sanhedrin funded operation.
Yeah, it's a state-sponsored operation. Yeah.
It's a specialized police operation.
Correct.
That implies training.
Yes, correct.
Saul would have.
That's what I was about to say.
Where did he get his training to do this kind of?
That's what I was about to get onto here. Yeah.
I mean, this is serious stuff.
No, yeah, I'm trying to put it in modern terms, but it's because the modern terms apply. Yeah, This is an organized state-sponsored operation that is operating here. Paul and his what is functionally a death squad are operating as a secret police. They're operating as a paramilitary unit, that's for sure. So they're clearly operating on paramilitary terms. The men who would have been rolling around would not have been Joe Schmoes just picked off the corner. These would have been trained swordsmen who would have been, to one degree or another, experienced in military conduct, who would have been able to actually operate on this kind of terms of being able to physically restrain, of being able to conduct search and seizure operations, to do what in modern terms we would call SSE, sensitive site exploitation, which is where they would go into a house, which is why you see entering house to house. Is they're not just entering house to house to take people, they're entering house to house to do what's called sensitive site exploitation, which is where you go in, you capture the targets that you want to take back off to an external site for interrogation, and then sensitive site exploitation is where you then gather information and intelligence that's in that property. So they may have they're looking for, scrolls with the names of certain other Christians, or places where they live, or other pieces of intelligence that can indicate to them where is the church, where are the Christians meeting, where are the Christians hiding, all the network, where are the Christians getting their food, where are the Christians working, where are the Christians doing this, all the different pieces that go into an intelligence operation of this magnitude.
Including evidence of written hymns, because we know that early hymns were penned at this point. Yeah, the most famous kind of hymns and as well as the very early creedal statements like we get in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We have therein a very early creed. What was delivered unto me, I delivered unto you as of first importance, that Christ was crucified according to the scriptures, and goes forth from there, right? Was died and was buried and was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, right? That whole verses there in 1 Corinthians 15 goes back to at the latest, at the absolute complete latest. It's the first 3, 4, 5 years after Christ's death, burial, resurrection. It's more likely in many church scholars' opinions that it goes back to within 18 months. Okay, super ridiculously early on. Nothing earlier than that. What we get there, that little creedal statement from Paul, not that he's the originator of it, again, that which was delivered to me, right? But that creedal statement goes back super early on, as early as anything that we have in all of the New Testament, the earliest, in fact. And so those kinds of things could have already potentially be started to be written down, because Christians very early on are clearly favoured writing things down in codexes and other such things. So yeah, that's what would have been occurring, right? And this is a significant state-sponsored operation that's an intelligence operation, and that would have involved all those various things that are involved in espionage. Paul and his squad, his secret police, would have been conducting espionage operations. They would have been conducting surveillance operations. They would have been conducting a whole bunch of different things that are tied up into. Because people who know how those things are conducted in the modern day can read things like this and see, and they can kind of know. And my family has background in some of these things, not in terms of what Paul did, but the broad categories of what we're talking about here. And understand what goes into operations like these kinds of things. It is not a small venture at all. It's a very complex, complicated, interconnected operation.
What makes me think those people in power today are planning all this?
Oh yes, yeah. What you want to do here, yeah, exactly. You take this and then you multiply it by a factor of 10,000, and you have the modern intelligence state.
Yeah.
And the Sanhedrin were funding it with their own money.
Yeah, correct.
These operations.
Oh yeah, for sure. That would have been
expensive operations.
Almost guaranteed. Yeah.
That's how much they detested the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Oh, exactly. Yes. Yeah. It's not.
But they were Jews.
No, I know, but that's the point. That's what a wicked and perverse, in other words, corrupt generation. That's what that Jesus condemned them wholeheartedly and said that you will all perish, and that all these curses that I have proclaimed upon you will befall you.
They would not have only been funding the administrative stuff; they were funding the salaries of these henchmen.
Yep, correct. Yep, the whole box and dice. Yeah, absolutely. They would have needed to be. They would have been establishing safe houses. They would have been establishing networks to be able to then conduct these espionage operations. They need to then provide for them and for their families whilst this is then being conducted. They then need to provide for their actual movements in and throughout the city of Jerusalem, moving from site to site, all these kinds of things. There's 1,000. Operations like this are very, very complex, even in an ancient context. More so in an ancient context, potentially. Yeah.
The Sanhedrin were the Jewish leader.
Yes, this is the Jewish council. This is the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. This is the highest of the Jewish authorities, the Pharisees, the Sadducees.
The name of Jesus
Yeah,
Christ.
they have committed themselves
All that
to destroy. Yep, all of this for the express purpose they have dedicated their life to, of ensuring that every Christian is wiped off the face of the planet.
Wow.
So do you think
I'm awful
they've
glad Saul got saved.
Well, that's why, and this is why, for starters, this is why the book of Acts gets written. It's not. I don't mean to dissect the scriptures like this, because every part of scripture is actually legitimately. I don't mean that in a nice airy fairy way, like all scripture is important. No, I mean it. It really all is. But in terms of the pragmatic impact that some areas of scripture have, the Acts of the Apostles is just, which is why a big reason why it was chosen, it is just such a linchpin of not just the New Testament, but of the entire canon of Scripture. Because the detailing of one of the most important figures in the history of God's people, namely Saul, when you see what he was doing and you see the purposefulness of what I'm trying to explain here, of the fact that at the beginning and at the top, from a surface level perspective, not from the perspective of God's sovereignty, just from a human limited perspective, we came this close to it all ending before it even got off the ground. Do you understand what I mean? From our perspective, not from here, from our perspective, from their perspective, in their mortal capacity, just as with ours, it came this close to getting shot down before it even took off the tarmac. Do you understand? Because of a very complex, well-funded, organised intelligence operation and sabotage operation. It's not.
We've done a very interesting delve into this part of history by just now immersing ourselves into that time period and looking into some of the details of how hateful the Sanhedrin were.
Yep.
If the Sanhedrin's hearts were stone, such stone, or to use your word, concrete, and then they were leading the Jewish people, their followers, then no wonder hearts were so hardened.
Yes.
And no wonder the Lord said, you know what? I'm washing my hands
Correct.
of you.
100%
and
correct.
I'm going
Else.
to the four corners of the earth.
Exactly. And this is not now just confined to the ethnic Jews. This is now expanding all over. Because that's the big thing, is because the other big ticket item of this kind of operation, especially when it's evolving and revolving around a city, in this case Jerusalem, is what would have been absolutely integral, central, could not be more vital to this kind of operation, is the parallel propaganda operation, right? The other than the sabotage, the targeted kidnap and execution, the manhunts, all that various pragmatics of the actual intelligence operation. Parallel to that, in tandem with that, you would also need a massive and sustained propaganda operation of garnering the actual support and manipulating the actual views of the people. Okay, I know we always kind of default to it because it's a really obvious and recent example, which is fair enough. But the Holocaust would not have even lasted 5 minutes if the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Joseph Goebbels, wasn't a thing. It wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes, because what you have to understand is that the real big picture movements, obviously things had already been going on, but the real substantive movements of first when you start to get the Jews being moved into ghettos, that's really on a mass level starting to occur 36, 37, 38, right? 1936, 37, 38. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, have already been in power since 1933. Without being smart, they had already got elected by virtue of the fact that they had legitimately won the popular support of the people. There was corruption involved in that election by virtue of the fact that they targeted the communists, but the election ballot itself was not rigged, right? It wasn't like, oh, everyone actually voted for the communist, or they actually voted for such and such, right? But they then just manipulated the ballots. No, the German people did actually legitimately vote in, on the ballots, I mean, the Nazis. So that's already going on. You don't get to late stage Holocaust, where it's basically how many Jews can we gas per minute, 1944, 1945, without essentially 15 years worth of lead up to those heights of that kind of point. Do you understand what I mean? Of intense nationwide propaganda, of moving the popular support and influencing and manipulating and coercing the popular opinion of the people. That would have been going on here as well, 100%. So you would have had I can guarantee you what sermons and other different things in the synagogues would have been about. It would have been about those damn Christians, about that. It would have been about that heretic Jesus of Nazareth. It would have been constantly sermon after sermon after sermon, readings and exegesis of different readings about how, see, here's why he couldn't have been the Christ, and it would have just been complete perversion and 100% eisegesis, not exegesis, all the kind of things. It would have been if you thought the Pharisees praying on street corners trying to look righteous was the most of what they did. No, they would have been on the street corners. They would have been street preaching, essentially, to try and use a Coinage term. They would have been proclaiming on the street corners about the heretic Jesus of Nazareth, and about maintaining the law of Moses, and about staying true to the faith of your fathers, and all the lies, constantly. You would have been in Jerusalem being constantly bombarded with lies.
It's probable that they were going from house to house.
Potentially, yeah, house to house, like JW is basically trying to propagandise.
Like
potentially, maybe,
and looking for elements of treachery or disloyalty.
Correct, but that would have been part of the intelligence operation. Yeah, they would have, exactly, and because dragging men and women off here, obviously it's associated with the church, but it's not a stretch to imagine at all that even those who were not necessarily overtly associated with the church in any capacity could have been hauled off for interrogations.
That part of the Talmud which says that, I really don't want to say this, but
no, go ahead.
It's factual.
Yeah, it is.
That Jesus is presently in hell boiling in excrement.
Yeah.
When was that roughly written? That would have been around this period.
Yeah, a lot of in the first kind of 200-ish years post. A lot of the Talmudic writing that you have today is 2 to 3 centuries AD. Afterwards, so it's in that time period. So a lot of the Talmudic writing that you get is from this time period onward, which is why it's so anti-Christ, right? It's also the other reason too, by the way, why modern Judaism is not just the ancient Old Testament Judaism. They just haven't converted to Jesus yet. No, it's completely AD. Virtually everything they have is AD in terms of modern, like Ashkenazi Jews, for example, right? It's not a personal thing against them. I'm talking about the religious aspect, right? Is that almost the entirety of what they have is AD, especially if it's starting to talk about things from Maimonides and other things from the Masoretic text, which are 1,000 years AD. Like we're talking 900, 1000 AD, right? Well after. And a lot of it is why you get that, especially from the Talmudic perspective. The Judaism of today is a modern reincarnation, reinterpretation, redefining of anything that even remotely resembled Old Covenant Judaism. It's just not. There's no way of arguing. That's just the history of it. It's not my opinion. It's just that's the baseline historical facts of how the Talmud's been written.
The Talmud came from the Babylonian exile period.
Correct.
And
in its origins, sure, yeah.
And it was so heavily corrupted during that Babylonian
yes, 100%,
period,
yes.
And then further corrupted by the Talmudic Mishnaic writings,
yep.
And then further corrupted by this period that you were talking about, the
yep.
combination of their modern Talmud with Maimonides and
yes, that's what I referenced earlier, yeah.
The other famous rabbis that they all like to quote.
Yeah, almost all of them are AD. Virtually, literally, almost. I can't even, in terms of popular usage, I can't even think of one. There may be one, but I can't think of them. They're almost entirely Anno Domini. Right? They're AD. They're after, well after, centuries after Jesus, and centuries after the time of the apostles. All those kind of things. So that's obviously. I know people understand it's a mission field, but you have to understand what kind of mission field. It's not. This is not. Judaism is not. Modern Judaism is not just Old Covenant, Old Testament Jews who are just a bit misguided on things. No, it's a completely different concept. I'm telling you right now, David would not even recognize modern Talmudic Judaism. By definition, he wouldn't recognize it.
That's not to forget that there are Jews who refuse any Talmudic
100%.
teachings or writings. The Kara Jews
yep, for sure.
only go off Old Testament scripture.
Yeah.
They don't recognise the rabbinical school. They don't recognise the modern prophets. They reject all of that, and they're searching for the Lord.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, what are all the other ones doing? Like the ones that they even declare they're atheists, but they're Jews.
Yeah, that's the ethnic component. Yeah, so like that's.
What are they getting out of this new system then?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been a significant rise in kind of secularization or atheistic. It's not really Judaism per se. They're Jewish ethnically, and they identify as Jew ethnically, not religiously. And there's that percentage, yes.
Like any other atheist that declare they don't believe.
Basically, yeah, essentially, pretty much, yes. Yeah, there's nothing particular about them by virtue of them being ethnically Jewish. It's just the fact that they're atheists or secular, or just secular humanist, or whatever the context is, who are just happening to be Jews. So at that point, it's no different than anything else. The ideology is just the ideology. And so, yeah, that's why I kind of, not for that specific reason, but for the reasons I mentioned about the Talmudic Judaism and its absolute predominance, is the fact that, like, generally speaking, on terms like Judeo-Christian should really kind of be avoided. It's not a helpful term at all, because it pretends that, what it does is it confuses and pretends essentially that modern Judaism is anything even remotely close to actual Old Covenant Judaism, if you want to refer to those terms, or let alone, more importantly, Christianity itself. Right? So, I'll leave it on that. Fortunately, these last couple of verses we have here all tie together pretty nicely, because we get a lot of the specific details in the coming weeks that we can then exegete from there. So in verses 4 through to 8, now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria. I will point out there that there are some manuscripts which would say a city of Samaria. The details of that are not really all that important, just because Samaria is a region, so you might be thinking the city of Samaria. What does that mean? Depends on which manuscript you're reading, but long story short, went into Samaria, right, and the cities there, proclaimed to them the Christ. Yeah. And the crowds with one accord paid attention to what was being said by Philip, when they heard him and saw the signs that he did. Right, again, this is a further explanation of what the purpose of miraculous signs like healing and tongues and prophecy and so on. They're for the purpose of proclaiming, and they were for the purpose of proclaiming the new covenant message in this context. Right, as the word is going forth. We now have the word that has gone forth. You're reading it right now. And so they paid attention with one accord, right? So again, that element of them being receptive. They clearly weren't, totally hostile. There was elements of receptiveness, and they paid attention. That's the Spirit of God going forth as an advanced party, so to speak, conducting advanced preparation of the battle space and preparing the way. Right? That's the Spirit of God having prepared their hearts, and so they're listening. They're paying attention. They're hearing these words being spoken here by Philip, and they paid attention, especially because they saw the miraculous signs and went, well, that's probably someone we should listen to. And so in verse 7, for unclean spirits being the broad New Testament reference to demons or to demonic, to demons that are possessing or oppressing someone, depending on the category. Unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who had them. And many who were paralyzed or lame were also healed. Right? So he's doing the works, right? The same kind of miraculous signs that we see. He's casting out demons from people who were oppressed or who were possessed, right? Came out with a loud voice, crying out, right? Because their time had ended. Their reign of proverbial freedom and terror was coming to an end, and they knew it. They knew that the authority of Christ, the one who had been given all authority in heaven and earth, had arrived, and this time of his kingdom that would see no end, as he put it, was now arriving. Right? And so these unclean spirits are being cast out. They don't have the authority and the power to remain there any longer. They're being cast out under the name, in other words, the authority of Jesus. Right? And as well as those who were paralyzed or lame were also being healed, again testifying to the validity and the reality of the gospel and the message that's being proclaimed. And so he concludes here in verse 8, so there was much joy in that city. And so that's a nice way to finish off this morning.
Samaria.
Yes, yeah, there's much joy in that city.
I thought Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom.
Yes, it is up in the top, yes. And so Samaria can also refer to the region. We can also then have Samaria as in the specific... Yeah. So you can. That's what I'm saying. That's why you've got...
It says city though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, but there's some manuscripts will have, because of that dual nature, you've got a scenario where some ancient manuscripts will say the definite article city, so the city. Some will say a city.
Oh, okay.
So because of the context, and that's just the way that sometimes that occurs in the manuscript heritage of how things get copied. If you have a scribe sitting there going, and he's reading about Samaria, and in his mind he's thinking the city, like I'm talking about the city proper, then he'll start writing about the city. So he'll include the definite article. Or if you've also got another scribe who's thinking about the region, when he's reading about the word Samaria and he's sitting there copying it, and he doesn't put in the word the, because he's thinking, oh, they must be talking about the region. Mm-hmm. So that's just sometimes what happens in the manuscripts as people are copying them through. That's the most likely explanation of why we have the either absence or presence of the definite article there in verse 8. Most of them have the definite article, the. Some don't. So that's just all the highlight is. Anyway, and so there's great joy in that city. Why? Because the kingdom had arrived, the gospel was taking hold and taking effect, and people were converting to the one true religion. Right? And you have these people who are finding much joy because A, you've got these incredible things occurring by virtue of the fact that they're being freed from demonic oppression or possession. Their infirmities, like physical infirmities, being paralysed and lame, we're told, are being healed, right? So there's great rejoicing in the power of Christ that's occurring, right? And the gospel is being proclaimed Christ is being proclaimed to them, is what we're told in verse 5. And so, as a result of all those things, there was much joy in that city. And so this is where we then begin from a macroscopic perspective, we then dive into the more specific examples of what occurs from verses 9 through the rest of the end of that chapter. Okay. Yeah?
I was thinking that verse, in verse 1, it says, except the apostles. So does it mean that they were protected?
Yes, so what...
Protected or-
Yeah, so what that would most likely be, we didn't end up covering that now that point out, so thanks for reminding me. In all likelihood, what that is the fact that, A, for starters, the apostles at this point are the bishops or the elders of the Church of Jerusalem, okay? So for starters, them kind of getting out of Dodge, if there were other Christians that had remained in the city, would not be a possibility, right? It depends on how much weight we put in the word all, or how we interpret the word all back in the kind of middle of verse 1, about they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, because there's plenty of times where the word all is used not in the literal sense of every single person, right? But the word all, right, in its various forms, pan in the Greek, pantes, meaning all, is used to describe large multitudes. Like you get that, for example, where, and the most obvious example is during the baptisms of John the Baptist, right? We get reference in the Gospels to all of Judea coming out to be baptized. Well, okay, so not literally every single person got baptized, right? Obviously, right? That would be a completely illogical conclusion to draw from anything we have there. So all, pantes, or in whichever form it takes, is being used to describe large multitudes. Okay, we do it all the time in English. We use general terms all the time. Without being smart, what I just said there, we use general terms all the time. Is a generalized term, because we don't literally use it all the time. We just do it we do it frequently, which is what, when someone says all the time, it almost never means all the time. It just means frequently, right? So I just realised that then, right? So that's what it is. We say it all the time in English, meaning frequently, not literally every time we open our mouth and say something. And so the reference to all there almost certainly, from a logical perspective, means significant numbers of the church in Jerusalem, potentially even the majority. Probably, actually, I would argue theologically the majority, probably. That seems the most rational explanation here. It would not have been every single Christian in the church except for the apostles. That's not generally how you should read the way that the scriptural authors use language, particularly the Greek. But except the apostles here is using it as a highlighting of the fact that the apostles were a notable group that did not flee. Does that make sense? Plenton apostolon, right? It's used reasonably frequently as a designator, right, as a preposition that indicates a kind of distinction. Not, all of them fled except for the apostles. So that means like the entire church left except for just the 12. No, that's not the way that the Greek should be read there. But probably the majority of them did flee. And probably also, by the way, under the instruction of the apostles. They would have told them to. Yeah, this is not mutiny. Like this is not every man. This is not like every man for himself, and they're all just running away scared. That's not what that is. No, this is not. They would have been instructed here to flee, right? They would have been instructed by the apostles to flee. It's not cowardice. It's not like they're all just running for the hills, and that's not what this is. They would have been instructed to disperse and to go to other locations for their safety and for the survival of them and their families, right? And for the survival, because keeping in mind again, the church is a divine human institution. It's a divine institution made up of people. For their families to be killed is by definition for the church to be killed. Do you understand? The survival of them and their families is the survival of the church, right? The church is made up of people. So them fleeing for the safety of their families is not some selfish thing at the expense of the church. No, it is the actual preservation of the church.
That's like during the war in
Yeah.
and Glasgow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And it was because we want the next generation to be here.
yeah, exactly. In that case, it's the survival of the nation. Yeah, exactly. 100% right. Yeah.
It's interesting that the dispersion happened to Judea and Samaria, and God is always good to his word. He said the gospel to the Jews first and then the Greeks, but look what he did.
Yeah.
He didn't evangelize the Greeks for the Gentiles first. He
Yeah, that's-
evangelized the half-Jews, the
Yeah.
Samaritans.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how merciful he is.
Exactly.
He left the Jews behind, and then he said, you know what? I've got fertile soil with Judea and Samaria. So
Yeah,
I'm going to
exactly.
disperse the proclaimers, the evangelists, there first.
Exactly. And
Isn't that wonderful?
It's keeping with the words that we've read earlier. Exactly. And it's keeping with the words that we read earlier on about the gospel going forth. We've cross-referenced it before, but the word about the gospel going forth to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. That's literally what this progression is. The Samaritan thing is even particularly more on the nose. I mean, that really kind of tells that the Samaritan reference here is really kind of God telling you exactly what he thought of the Sanhedrin and exactly what he thought of that generation of Jews in Jerusalem and in the elsewhere, because he not that he literally phrased it this way. This is me putting words on it, but it's kind of like, oh, you've declared war against me. Well, that's cool. I'll take my kingdom to those dogs, the Samaritans, that you hate. It's the biggest. It's such a. The word I want to use is cheeky, but like I think you get the center of what I'm getting at. I'm not making light of it. It's just like it's a hilariously ironic move.
Well, all part of God's tapestry.
Yeah, correct. It's hilariously ironic that the Sanhedrin and the people who postulate themselves to be the most closely connected to God, and they're here trying to destroy everything that he's doing, and he takes it to their dog enemy cousins, essentially, and who they hate with a writhing passion, who they consider to be absolute dirt beneath their feet, and he takes it to them. It's just hilarious. It's so ironic, and it's so reminiscent of he who sits in the heavens laughs at the mockeries in the sky. Yeah, God has the last laugh. It's so ironic, and anyone who has an appreciation for irony sees how hilarious it is. But yeah, that's essentially today's lesson, and so that's where it ends on that. There's obviously a lot of detail that's been drawn out of that, and so then over the successive weeks, as I said, we'll then cover the two specific stories and accounts that were then given throughout the rest of this chapter 8 here. So, unless there's any final questions or comments. Good. All right. Thank you.